The wind howled through the dense forest, whipping against Jake's face as he trudged through the knee-deep snow. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, forming small clouds in the freezing air. Every step felt heavier than the last, but he tightened his grip on the limp body in his arms. The husky, barely conscious, whimpered weakly against his chest. It hadn't always been this way. Just hours ago, the dog had been full of life, bounding through the snow with unbreakable energy. But now it was different. Now it was a matter of life and death. Jake had found him lying in the snow, his thick fur matted with ice, his body unnaturally still. At first, he thought the husky was dead. The cold had sunk its merciless claws into the animal, and its breaths were shallow, almost non-existent. But when Jake crouched beside him, pressing his gloved hand gently against the dog's side, he felt the faintest rise and fall of its chest. He couldn't leave him. Not out here. The blizzard had rolled in faster than expected, swallowing the sky in a thick veil of white. Visibility was near zero, and the temperature had plummeted far below freezing. Jake knew that if he didn't act fast, neither of them would make it back. With no time to hesitate, he stripped off his heavy coat, wrapping it tightly around the shivering husky. Then, bracing himself, he lifted the animal into his arms and began the long, punishing trek back. Each step was agony. The weight of the dog, the relentless wind, the biting cold, it all conspired to drag him down. But he refused to give in. He couldn't. Minutes stretched into eternity. His legs burned. His fingers, even beneath thick gloves, ached with the early signs of frostbite. The husky, though wrapped securely, barely stirred, and that terrified Jake more than anything. Was he already too late? His mind raced with desperation. He thought of his cabin, the crackling fire, the first aid kit tucked away in the cupboard. If only he could get there in time. If only he could push just a little farther. And then, just as his strength began to fail, he saw it. A shadow in the distance. The faint outline of his cabin, half buried under the relentless snow. Relief flooded his chest, but he had no time to savor it. He pushed forward, ignoring the throbbing pain in his legs, the numbness in his fingers. Bursting through the door, he collapsed onto the wooden floor, clutching the husky tightly. The warmth of the cabin hit him like a shockwave, but he didn't stop. Not yet. He had one last battle to fight. What happened next would change everything. Jake's hands trembled as he laid the husky down near the roaring fire. The dog's fur was soaked with melted snow, his breathing shallow. Jake's heart pounded. Was he too late? No, he muttered, forcing himself to focus. He had to act fast. He grabbed a thick blanket and wrapped it around the husky, then rushed to heat some water. His training in wilderness survival told him that hypothermia wasn't just about cold, it was about the body shutting down. He needed to raise the dog's temperature slowly. Rubbing his hands together, he began massaging warmth back into the husky's legs. Minutes passed, then an hour. The husky barely moved. Jake felt frustration claw at him. "Come on, buddy," he murmured, running a gentle hand over the dog's head. "Don't quit on me." Then, just as he was about to lose hope, the husky stirred. A soft whimper, a slow blink. Jake exhaled in relief. "There you go. That's it." The husky lifted his head slightly, his icy blue eyes locking onto Jake's. There was something in that gaze, a silent gratitude, a deep intelligence that unsettled Jake in the strangest way. "Where did you even come from?" Jake muttered, inspecting the dog's collar. There was no tag, just a frayed leather strap. Had he been abandoned? Lost? The husky didn't answer, of course, but he let out a soft huff, resting his head against Jake's leg. It felt like trust. As exhaustion pulled Jake into an uneasy sleep on the floor beside the dog, he didn't notice the husky's ears twitch, his head lifting at the sound of something beyond the howl of the wind. A sound too faint for human ears, a sound that meant danger. Jake woke to the husky growling. Not a low, contented rumble, but a sharp, guttural warning. His groggy mind snapped to attention. "What is it?" he muttered, sitting up. Then he heard it. A creak. At first, he thought it was just the wind pushing against the cabin walls, but then came another. A footstep. Jake's blood ran cold. No one should be out here. His cabin was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but forest and snow. No one should be here. The husky growled again, rising to his feet despite his weakened state. His fur bristled. His ears were pinned back. Something was wrong. Jake moved quickly. Reaching for the rifle, he kept propped against the wall. He moved toward the door, his breath tight in his throat. He flicked on the porch light and froze. There were tracks in the snow, fresh tracks, leading straight to his cabin. His heart slammed against his ribs. Who had been out there? He turned back, but the husky was already ahead of him, standing near the window, his muscles tense. His ears twitched, tracking something. Then, a shadow moved outside. Jake's grip tightened on the rifle. He swallowed hard and forced himself to step toward the door. The husky was right beside him, his body trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of standing after his ordeal. Jake hesitated for only a moment before yanking open the door. The storm had calmed. Snowflakes drifted lazily in the moonlight. But the tracks in the snow, they led into the trees, and whoever had made them was watching. Jake couldn't see them, but he felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unmistakable weight of unseen eyes. The husky let out a low, warning growl. Then, suddenly, a shot rang out. The bullet struck the porch railing, splintering wood inches from Jake's side. He dove back inside, slamming the door shut as his mind raced. Someone was out there, and they had a gun. His pulse pounded in his ears. Who the hell would shoot at him in the middle of nowhere? And why? The husky was still at the door, his body rigid, his gaze locked onto something beyond the glass. Then Jake realized this wasn't random. Someone had been tracking the husky. Jake had no time to think. He killed the lights in the cabin, plunging them into darkness. He pressed his back against the wall, listening. The wind had picked up again, but he could still hear footsteps crunching in the snow outside. Then voices. 2 of them. He has a dog? Damn it. We can't let him keep it. Jake's grip on the rifle tightened. His breath was shallow. The husky had collapsed onto the floor again, but his eyes were still alert. He let out a soft huff, his ears flicking toward the voices. Jake's mind raced. The husky, he wasn't just some lost dog. Someone wanted him. But why? Another shot. This one hit the cabin wall. Jake had to move. He threw open the back door and bolted into the trees, the husky struggling to keep up. They needed cover. They needed a plan. But as they ran, the husky suddenly stopped. His ears perked up. Then, without warning, he lunged at Jake, knocking him down just as another gunshot rang out. The bullet missed Jake's head by inches. His heart slammed against his ribs. The husky had saved his life. Jake scrambled to his feet. The men were getting closer, their flashlights bouncing through the trees. He had no choice. He fired a warning shot into the air. Silence. Then, footsteps retreating. The men were gone. Jake turned to the husky, who was panting heavily, his legs trembling. You knew, Jake whispered. He ran a shaking hand over the husky's fur. The dog nudged him weakly, then collapsed against him. Jake held him close, his mind reeling. What had just happened? And what exactly had he just gotten himself into? Back at the cabin, Jake tended to the husky, his thoughts racing. Who were those men? Why had they been hunting the dog? He didn't know the answers yet. But one thing was clear. This husky wasn't just any stray. And whatever secrets he carried, they were worth killing for. Jake sat on the wooden floor of his cabin, staring at the husky as the fire crackled between them. His fingers absently traced the bullet hole in the wall. His heart was still pounding from the gunshots, from the voices in the dark. Who were those men? And why did they want this dog so badly? He glanced at the husky, who lay with his head resting on his front paws. Despite the exhaustion in his eyes, he was still alert, his ears twitching at every small sound. It was as if he expected something to happen. Something about this dog wasn't normal. Jake exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. He needed to think. He had come out to the mountains for peace, for solitude. He had never wanted to get involved in anything dangerous. And yet, here he was, in the middle of a storm, with a mysterious husky and armed men after them. His instincts screamed at him to take the dog and leave. But something deeper, something he couldn't explain, told him that this was important, that this dog had come into his life for a reason. And then the husky lifted his head. The motion was slow, deliberate. His icy blue eyes locked onto Jake's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Then the husky did something that changed everything. He nudged Jake's hand, then pawed at the floorboards. Jake frowned. "What is it?" The husky pawed again, more urgently this time. Jake hesitated. Then, cautiously, he grabbed a knife from the counter and pried at the wooden floorboard. It lifted with a soft creak, revealing a shallow compartment beneath it. Inside was an old metal box. Jake's breath caught. He had lived in this cabin for years and had never noticed this before. His pulse quickened as he reached inside, brushing away dust and lifting the box onto the floor. The husky sat back, watching intently. Jake hesitated, then unlatched the lid. Inside was a stack of yellowed papers, a few faded photographs, and his stomach twisted. A military dog tag. The name was barely visible, but he could still make it out. Shadow. Jake's eyes snapped to the husky. His heart pounded as the pieces started to click together. This wasn't just any stray dog. This was a trained military dog. Jake shuffled through the papers, his hands shaking. Some were official-looking documents, but others were handwritten notes, scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic script. One phrase caught his eye. Project Fenrir. Do not let them find him. His stomach turned. The husky Shadow had been running from something, and now so was Jake. The more he read, the darker the truth became. Shadow hadn't been just a military dog. He had been part of an experiment, one designed to enhance intelligence, perception, and even something more. Jake frowned. The documents referenced something called cognitive augmentation, a classified research project focused on enhancing canine intelligence. But the program had been shut down abruptly, and then the final note made his blood run cold. Shadow escaped. If he finds the right person, he'll lead them to the truth. Jake's hands clenched into fists. The right person. Shadow had chosen him. Jake looked back at the husky. Shadow was watching him closely, his piercing blue eyes unreadable. "You knew this was here, didn't you?" Jake whispered. Shadow gave the smallest nod. Not a coincidence. Not an accident. Jake's throat tightened. This wasn't just a lost dog. This was something bigger. A pounding at the door shattered the moment. Jake's breath caught. His grip tightened on the rifle. Shadow's ears pinned back, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. They had found them. Jake moved quickly, dousing the fire to plunge the cabin into darkness. He pressed his back against the wall, heart hammering. Through the thin curtain, he could see shadowy figures outside. Flashlights cut through the storm, casting eerie beams across the snow. A voice rang out. "Hand over the dog, and no one gets hurt." Jake gritted his teeth. Not a chance. Shadow let out a sharp breath and turned, nudging at Jake's hand again, urging him, guiding him. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed his pack, threw open the back door, and plunged into the freezing night. Shadow followed. Bullets ripped through the trees behind them, but Shadow led the way, moving with uncanny precision through the darkness, as if he knew exactly where to go. Jake didn't know what awaited them. He didn't know what truth they were running toward. But as he followed Shadow into the unknown, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The cold air burned Jake's lungs as he sprinted through the forest, his boots crunching through the deep snow. Shadow ran beside him, his movements sharp and calculated, his ears flicking toward every sound. Behind them, voices shouted and gunshots rang through the trees. Jake knew they were running out of time. Shadow wasn't just a lost husky. He was the key to something bigger, something dangerous. The military had experimented on him, altering his intelligence, enhancing his awareness beyond anything natural. And now they wanted him back. But Shadow wasn't going back. Jake's grip tightened around the strap of his rifle as they pushed forward through the dense trees. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Then suddenly, Shadow stopped. Jake skidded to a halt, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "What is it?" he whispered. Shadow's ears twitched. His head snapped to the right. Then Jake heard it too. A low hum, faint but growing stronger. And then he saw it, just beyond the clearing. A hidden facility. Jake's stomach twisted. This wasn't just some random chase. This wasn't just about Shadow. They had been hurting him here. The snowstorm had concealed it before, but now, the structure loomed in front of them. Low concrete walls, steel fencing, and a guard tower standing like a silent predator against the night. Dim red lights flickered along the perimeter, casting eerie glows against the snow. Jake cursed under his breath. This wasn't a coincidence. The men hunting them, this was where they had come from. And now, he and Shadow were trapped. Shadow let out a low whine, his eyes flicking between Jake and the facility. There was something urgent in his gaze, something desperate. Jake swallowed hard. He had two options. Run. Keep moving. Try to disappear into the wilderness before the soldiers caught up. Fight. Take a stand. Find out the truth. And make sure Shadow never fell into the wrong hands again. Shadow made the decision for him. He bolted forward. Shadow, wait. Jake hissed, but the Husky was already moving, his paws kicking up snow as he sprinted toward the facility's perimeter. Jake didn't have a choice. He followed. The fence loomed ahead, topped with barbed wire. Shadow didn't slow. He leaped onto a nearby storage crate, using it as a springboard to bound over the fence with breathtaking agility. Jake barely had time to be amazed. He scrambled up the crate, gripping the icy metal, and swung himself over just as shouts erupted behind them. They were inside. Jake pressed himself against the wall of the nearest building, his breath coming fast. Shadow crouched beside him, his ears flicking toward every sound. Footsteps. Voices. The guards were coming. Shadow nudged Jake's leg, then moved, low to the ground, silent, weaving through the darkness. He knew this place. Jake followed, his heart pounding. They reached a side entrance. The door was cracked open, as if someone had expected them. Jake's pulse hammered in his ears as they slipped inside. The hallway was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of chemicals and sterilized metal. Doors lined the corridor, each marked with numbers and codes. Shadow led him deeper. Then, finally, they reached it. A door marked Project Fenrir. Terminated. Jake's breath caught. Shadow pawed at the door. Jake swallowed hard, then pushed it open. Inside, rows of empty kennels lined the walls. Metal examination tables. Stacks of files, scattered and forgotten. And in the center of the room, a computer terminal. Jake rushed toward it, his fingers flying over the keys. The system was still active, though many files had been deleted. He pulled up the last remaining documents, his heart pounding as the words appeared on the screen. Project Fenrir, Classified Intelligence Report. Subject 017, Shadow. Displayed unprecedented cognitive ability, problem-solving, pattern recognition, and advanced tactical awareness exceeding baseline canine intelligence. Evidence suggests human-like reasoning capabilities. Neural scans indicate possible anomalous activity beyond expected parameters. Subject escaped during termination order. Reason unknown. Jake's blood ran cold. They hadn't just trained Shadow. They had created something more, something they couldn't control, and they had tried to kill him for it. Shadow let out a soft whimper. He nudged Jake's hand, as if telling him to keep going. Jake scrolled further. Then he saw the final entry. Urgent directive. Subject 017 is still active. If found, terminate immediately. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs. They didn't want Shadow back. They wanted him dead. And then, the alarms blared. Red warning lights flashed across the facility. A mechanical voice echoed through the halls. Intrusion detected. Security lockdown initiated. Jake spun, his pulse racing. Shadow tensed, his ears flicking toward the hallway. They had to move now. Jake grabbed the files and bolted for the exit. Shadow was right beside him, his muscles coiled, ready for whatever came next. The sound of boots thundered down the hall. Jake ducked into the shadows, gripping his rifle. His mind was screaming. He needed to get Shadow out. That was all that mattered. Then Shadow did something Jake didn't expect. He stepped forward. Jake grabbed for him. No! Shadow let out a deep, commanding bark, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls. For a split second, The soldiers hesitated. And that was all Jake needed. He raised his rifle and fired, taking down the first two before the others reacted. Shadow leaped into action, his movements a blur as he darted between them, knocking them off balance, disarming them with an almost supernatural precision. He wasn't just fighting, he was outthinking them. Jake took down the last soldier, his breath ragged. The hallway was silent again. Shadow stood beside him, panting. Blood, not his own, dripped onto the floor. His blue eyes met Jake's. It was time to go. Jake and Shadow raced through the facility, dodging guards and security drones. Every time they hit an obstacle, Shadow found the solution. He wasn't just leading the way, he was calculating. Finally, they burst through a side exit into the frozen night. The storm had cleared, revealing a vast stretch of wilderness ahead. Behind them, alarms still blared. But no one followed. Not yet. Jake knelt beside Shadow, running a hand through his thick fur. "We did it," he whispered. Shadow licked his hand once, then looked toward the horizon. Jake followed his gaze. There was still more to uncover. The truth about Project Fenrir, about what had really been done to Shadow. But for now, they had won. And as Jake and Shadow disappeared into the wilderness, one thing was certain. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The stars stretched endlessly above, a cold but beautiful reminder of how vast the world was. The forest had long since swallowed Jake and Shadow, their footprints disappearing beneath fresh snowfall. The distant echoes of alarms had faded into nothing. They were finally free, but freedom came with questions. Jake sat beside a small fire, his rifle laid across his lap, but his focus wasn't on it. His eyes were locked on Shadow, who sat just beyond the firelight, his gaze fixed on the night sky. A husky, no, something more than a husky. Jake had seen dogs with intelligence before. He had seen loyalty, resilience, and even intuition. But Shadow? He wasn't just smart. He was aware. Jake exhaled, watching his breath form a thin mist in the air. The documents he had taken from the facility sat in his backpack, waiting to be fully read. But he didn't need to read them to understand the truth anymore. The military had tried to create something beyond a dog. They had succeeded. And then they had been afraid of what they had made. They had wanted Shadow dead not because he was dangerous, but because he was unstoppable. Jake reached out, brushing his fingers against Shadow's fur. "You knew, didn't you?" Shadow blinked, slow and deliberate. He shifted closer, resting his head lightly against Jake's knee. The warmth of his presence was grounding. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. "They weren't just chasing you. They were trying to erase you." Shadow didn't move. He didn't need to. Jake already knew. Jake thought back to the moment he had found Shadow, half frozen and injured in the snow. If he hadn't stopped, if he had ignored the pain in those ice-blue eyes, Shadow would have been gone. But Shadow hadn't been the one who needed saving. Jake had been. The world had hardened Jake. He had come to these mountains to escape, to leave behind the weight of his past. But Shadow had pulled him back, forced him to face something bigger than himself. And now, standing at the edge of this new reality, Jake realized something. Heroism wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It wasn't about winning fights or taking down the bad guys. It was about standing by someone when no one else would. It was about loyalty, trust, and fighting for what was right, even when the world tried to silence the truth. Shadow had done that, not just for himself, but for Jake. For whatever reason, he had chosen Jake to help him, to fight alongside him. And Jake wasn't going to let him down. Jake ran a hand over his face. He knew what came next. They couldn't go back. If the military had covered up Project Fenrir once, they would do it again. Shadow would always be hunted, always be seen as an experiment, never as what he truly was. A friend, a survivor, a being who deserved more. Jake clenched his fists. He had spent so long trying to escape the world. But now he had to face it, because Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was proof of something bigger, something people needed to know. Jake took a deep breath. "We need to get this out." He patted the bag filled with files. "The world needs to know what they did." Shadow lifted his head. His eyes met Jake's, searching, assessing. Then after a long pause, he nodded. Jake let out a shaky laugh. You really do understand everything, don't you? Shadow huffed, a quiet, knowing sound. Jake smiled. They weren't just running anymore. They had a mission. The fire crackled between them, casting long shadows on the snow. Jake sat back, staring at the flames, his mind turning over everything they had been through. He thought about the men who had tried to kill them, about the facility, the experiments, the fear that had driven them to hunt Shadow like a threat instead of protecting him like a soldier. But above all, he thought about the Husky sitting beside him, the one who had walked through fire and ice, who had risked everything, not for himself, but for trust, for loyalty, for something deeper than survival. And that was the message Jake would carry with him. In a world that tried to control, to manipulate, to erase what it didn't understand, sometimes the bravest thing was simply to exist, to choose trust over fear, to run forward, even when the world tried to chase you down. Jake reached out and ruffled Shadow's fur. Come on, buddy, let's change the world. And together, they disappeared into the night. A man and a Husky, not just running, fighting for the truth.